If Brandon wants the company so badly, maybe he can have what's left of it. Those were the words that kept echoing through my mind as I sat at the far end of my parents' dining table, staring at a plate of untouched pot roast that had long since gone cold. My name is Nolan Whitaker, and at 30 years old, I had built a company worth more money than anyone in my family had ever imagined. Yet somehow, on that particular Sunday evening, I felt like the least important person in the room. The dining room looked exactly as it had throughout my childhood. The same oak table, the same framed family photos lining the walls, the same grandfather clock ticking steadily in the corner. But something felt different. Maybe it was because I had spent the last 8 years sacrificing nearly everything to build my business, while everyone else continued treating me like the quiet younger brother who was expected to stay out of the spotlight. My father raised his glass. "I think it's time we discuss the future." The words sounded harmless enough. I nodded politely and took a sip of water. Across from me, Brandon leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who already believed he had won. Brandon was 3 years older than me. Growing up, he had been the golden child. Teachers loved him. Coaches praised him. Relatives bragged about him. When he earned average grades, people celebrated. When I earned perfect ones, people expected it. I learned a long time ago that effort and recognition were two very different things. "Your mother and I have been talking," Dad continued, "and we think it's important for the family to start planning ahead." My mother smiled warmly at Brandon. She always smiled that way when looking at him. Brandon folded his hands and glanced toward me. There was something rehearsed about his expression, something that immediately put me on guard. "Nolan," he said, "you've done really well with the company." I nodded. "Thank you. You've built something impressive." "I appreciate that." He smiled wider. "Which is exactly why it's time to think about what happens next." The room became strangely quiet. Even the ticking clock seemed louder. I looked from Brandon to my parents. None of them appeared surprised by where the conversation was going. That was my first clue. Brandon rested his elbows on the table. Dad always intended for me to run the family legacy. I blinked. The family legacy? The company. He said it casually, as if discussing the weather. "You've proven you can build things. I've always been the one meant to lead them." For a moment, I honestly thought he was joking. Then I looked at my parents. Neither of them laughed. My father's expression remained serious. My mother's eyes shifted toward me with what looked suspiciously like expectation. Brandon continued, "I think it's time you transfer majority control to me and let me take over operations." There it was, the real reason for the family dinner. Not a celebration, not a discussion, an ambush. Years of 16-hour workdays, years of sleeping in my office, years of risking everything I owned, reduced to a simple request from the brother who had never attended a single investor meeting, negotiated a single contract, or signed a single payroll check. I set down my glass carefully. "You want my company?" Brandon smiled. "Our company." My father nodded slowly. "Family should support family." I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not sadness. Clarity. Crystal clear clarity. They weren't asking. They expected compliance. They believed the ending had already been written. Brandon looked around the table like a future CEO preparing for applause. My mother smiled. My father waited. I smiled too. And that smile would become the most expensive mistake Brandon Whitaker ever made. Because at that exact moment, while everyone else thought I was surrendering, I was already planning an exit they would never see coming. I did not sleep much that night. Not because of what Brandon had said, but because of how easily everyone else had accepted it. I sat alone in my apartment overlooking the river, watching the lights from the city reflect on the dark water below. 8 years. That was how long it had taken me to build the company. 8 years of risk, uncertainty, and sacrifice. Yet at that dinner table, they had spoken about it as if it were a family heirloom sitting in an attic waiting to be handed down. The truth was much simpler. Nobody had given me anything. I still remembered the first tiny office I rented when I was 22 years old. It was barely larger than a storage room. The carpet was stained. The air conditioning worked only when it felt like it. During the summer, the temperature inside often climbed above 85 degrees. I could not afford employees then. I answered customer calls, managed invoices, handled sales meetings, and cleaned the office myself. Some nights I slept on a folding cot beside my desk because driving home felt like a waste of time. Back then, nobody in my family cared about the business. My parents called it a phase. Brandon called it a hobby. Every holiday gathering included questions about when I planned to get a real job. They laughed when I missed vacations because I was meeting clients. They rolled their eyes when I talked about growth plans. Success is funny that way. People ignore your effort until the results become impossible to ignore. Then suddenly, everyone remembers being supportive. Around year 4, things started changing. Revenue increased. We landed larger contracts. We hired talented people. The company moved into a modern office downtown. Investors began calling. Industry publications mentioned our growth. That was when Brandon became interested. At first it was subtle. He started asking questions during family dinners. Then he began introducing me to people as his younger brother who owned that company. Eventually, he started speaking about the business as though he had helped create it. I noticed it, but I ignored it. It felt harmless at the time. Looking back, that was probably my mistake. The following morning, my phone buzzed while I was making coffee. It was my mother. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Your father and I were talking after dinner," she said. "We are glad everyone is finally discussing the future." I poured coffee into a mug and stared out the kitchen window. The future of what? There was a brief pause. The company, of course. I smiled despite myself. Even now, she said it as though ownership were merely a technical detail. "Brandon has always had leadership qualities," she continued. "You know that." I remembered every science fair project he never finished. Every responsibility he abandoned halfway through. Every opportunity handed to him because somebody else believed in his potential more than he did. "Sure," I replied quietly. "Leadership qualities." After we ended the call, I opened my laptop and reviewed company reports. Numbers had always made more sense to me than people. Numbers did not play favorites. Numbers did not rewrite history. Numbers simply reflected reality. And the reality was that every dollar of value inside that company existed because thousands of decisions had been made correctly over many years. Decisions Brandon had never been part of. Around noon, Rachel Hayes, my chief financial officer, stepped into my office carrying a stack of reports. She had been with me almost from the beginning. If anyone understood the company, it was her. She studied my face carefully. "You look like somebody who just survived a family dinner." I laughed softly. "That obvious?" She set the reports on my desk. "Only because I know your family." Then her expression grew serious. "What happened?" I leaned back in my chair and thought about Brandon's confident smile, my father's approval, and my mother's expectation. For the first time, I said the words out loud. "My brother thinks the company belongs to him." Rachel stared at me for several seconds. Then she slowly shook her head. Neither of us knew it yet, but that conversation was the first step toward a decision that would change everything. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to things I had ignored for years. Once you stop looking at people through the lens of family, you begin seeing them for who they really are. Brandon had always carried himself with a kind of effortless confidence. Growing up, everyone called it charisma. Looking back, I realized much of it came from never having to face consequences. If he wanted something, somebody usually gave it to him. If he failed, somebody explained it away. If he made a mistake, somebody else fixed it. I was the opposite. Nobody expected success from me, which meant every achievement had to be earned. Late one afternoon, I found myself driving past the neighborhood where we grew up. The houses looked smaller than I remembered. The basketball hoop in my parents' driveway was still there. So was the maple tree my father planted when Brandon was born. Seeing it brought back memories I had not thought about in years. I remembered being 12 years old and spending an entire summer mowing lawns to save enough money for my first computer. Brandon wanted one too. He received his as a birthday gift. I remembered working weekends in high school while Brandon focused on sports and social events. When college came around, I applied for scholarships. Brandon received help from my parents. None of this had seemed unfair at the time. It was simply the way things were. Families develop patterns. Everyone learns their role. Brandon was the star. I was the dependable one. The problem with roles is that people expect them to continue forever. The next family gathering happened the following Saturday. My mother invited everyone over for lunch. I almost declined, but curiosity got the better of me. When I arrived, Brandon was already there. He was standing in the kitchen talking to my father. The moment I walked in, both of them became unusually quiet. My father greeted me with a nod. Brandon smiled. "There he is," he said. "The future chairman." Something about the joke felt rehearsed. During lunch, The conversation kept drifting toward business. Not strategy, not operations. Ownership. Brandon asked questions about company structure. My father asked about voting rights. My mother asked whether leadership transitions were difficult. They spoke carefully, but the pattern was impossible to miss. At one point, Brandon leaned back in his chair and said, "A company becomes stronger when it stays in the family." I looked at him. "It is already in the family." He laughed as though I had missed the point. Maybe I had, or maybe I was finally understanding it. After lunch, I stepped outside onto the back patio. The autumn air felt cool against my face. A few minutes later, Brandon joined me. He rested his arms on the railing and stared across the yard. "You know, this would be easier if you worked with me," he said. "Worked with you?" I asked. "You know what I mean." There was no anger in his voice. No hostility. That was what made the conversation unsettling. He genuinely believed he deserved a seat at the top of something he had never helped build. He believed family loyalty entitled him to ownership. As I drove home that evening, I kept replaying the conversation. For the first time, I stopped asking myself why Brandon wanted the company. The answer was obvious. The more important question was why he seemed so certain he was eventually going to get it. And the more I thought about that question, the more convinced I became that somebody had already made promises behind my back. The following Tuesday, I received the answer to the question that had been bothering me for days. It arrived disguised as an ordinary phone call. Daniel Mercer, the attorney who had handled several of my business contracts over the years, asked if I had a few minutes to talk. His voice carried the careful tone lawyers use when they are trying to discuss something sensitive without creating unnecessary alarm. I closed my office door and told him to go ahead. There was a brief silence before he spoke. "I had lunch with someone from your father's country club last week," he said. "Your name came up." I leaned back in my chair. That does not sound unusual. Normally, it would not be. Another pause. "But apparently your father has been telling people for months that Brandon will eventually take control of your company." For a moment, I simply stared at the city skyline outside my window. Months. Not weeks. Not days. Months. The conversation at dinner had not been spontaneous. It had not been an idea they recently developed. It was a plan that had already been discussed, repeated, and quietly accepted by everyone except me. "Interesting," I said calmly. Daniel hesitated. "I thought you should know." After the call ended, I sat in silence. The office around me remained busy. Phones rang. Employees moved through hallways. Computer screens glowed behind glass conference room walls. Yet everything felt strangely distant. The realization settled over me piece by piece. My family was not reacting to my success. They were planning for ownership of it. Somewhere along the way, they had convinced themselves that my role was temporary. Build the company, grow the company, then hand the company over. The more I thought about it, the more details began falling into place. Brandon's sudden interest, my parents' assumptions, the oddly specific questions during family dinners. None of it had appeared overnight. It had been growing quietly beneath the surface. That evening, I invited Rachel Hayes to dinner. We met at a small steakhouse a few blocks from the office. Nothing fancy, just a quiet place where people could talk without interruption. After the waiter left, I told her everything. The country club conversations, the assumptions, the expectation that Brandon would somehow inherit control of a company he had never helped build. Rachel listened carefully. When I finished, she folded her hands and looked at me. "Do you want my honest opinion?" she asked. "Always. They are treating your company like family property instead of a business." I nodded. "That is exactly what it feels like." She took a sip of water. "Then you should stop viewing this as a family problem." I raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean?" "It means you need to look at the situation like a founder protecting an asset." Her words stayed with me long after dinner ended. Back at my apartment, I opened my laptop and reviewed ownership documents, shareholder agreements, and valuation reports. For years, I had focused on growth, expansion, opportunity. For the first time, I started thinking about exit strategies. Not because I planned to leave, not yet, but because I suddenly understood something important. The people around me were already making plans for my future without my permission. If I wanted control over what happened next, I needed to start making plans of my own. And as midnight approached, one possibility began standing out from all the others. A possibility so simple that I almost laughed when it occurred to me. Over the next several weeks, I became very good at pretending everything was normal. That turned out to be easier than I expected. The funny thing about people who believe they are winning is that they stop paying attention. Brandon certainly did. Every time I saw him, he acted more confident than before. He spoke about future plans. He talked about leadership. He dropped hints about expansion strategies despite having no involvement in the company itself. Meanwhile, I listened. I nodded. I smiled when necessary. And then I went back to work. One Monday morning, Rachel walked into my office carrying a thick folder. She closed the door behind her and placed it on my desk. Inside were updated valuation reports, acquisition trends, and a list of companies that had recently purchased businesses in our sector. I spent most of the day reviewing every page. For years, acquisition offers had arrived regularly. I had always ignored them. Building the company had been my goal, not selling it. But circumstances change. Priorities change. What surprised me most was not how many potential buyers existed. It was how interested they were. Several larger firms had been watching our growth for years. They saw value where my family saw entitlement. They understood the effort behind every contract, every employee, every milestone. By the end of the week, I quietly authorized preliminary conversations. Nothing official, nothing binding, just conversations. Rachel coordinated everything through secure channels. Very few people knew what was happening. That was intentional. I wanted facts before making decisions. The first meeting took place in a conference room 40 floors above downtown. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. The executives across the table came prepared. They knew our numbers. They knew our market position. They knew our potential. For nearly 3 hours, we discussed operations, growth opportunities, and long-term strategy. Not once did anyone ask about Brandon. Not once did anyone mention family expectations. They cared about performance, results, value. Walking back to my car afterward, I felt something I had not experienced in weeks. Relief. For the first time since that dinner, I was looking at the situation from a position of strength rather than frustration. A few days later, my mother called again. Her timing was becoming almost predictable. She asked whether I had given any more thought to the future. I told her I was evaluating options. That answer seemed to satisfy her. The truth was that I was evaluating options more seriously than she could possibly imagine. As the conversations continued, interest from buyers increased. Numbers that once seemed impossible started appearing on spreadsheets. Every new proposal reinforced the same conclusion. The company had become larger than I realized. One evening, after everyone had gone home, Rachel and I sat alone in the conference room reviewing another offer. She looked across the table and asked a simple question. If you sold tomorrow, what would you do? I stared at the city lights outside the glass wall. The question caught me off guard. For years, my identity had been tied to building teams, building systems, building growth. I had never seriously considered what came after. I do not know, I admitted. Rachel smiled. That means you should start thinking about it. On my drive home, I found myself imagining possibilities. Travel, freedom, time, the ability to wake up without a schedule dictated by meetings and deadlines. For the first time, the idea did not feel frightening. It felt exciting. And as that thought settled into place, another realization followed close behind. If the company no longer existed in my hands, then nobody could take it from me. Nobody could inherit it. Nobody could demand control over it. The more I thought about that possibility, the more elegant it seemed. By the time I pulled into my parking garage, I was no longer asking whether selling was realistic. I was asking how soon it could happen. The next month moved faster than any period I could remember. Once the process began, momentum seemed to build on its own. Meetings turned into negotiations. Negotiations turned into formal proposals. Every week brought new numbers, new documents, and new conversations with people who saw the company not as a family asset, but as a valuable business. Rachel managed the process. With her usual precision, Daniel Mercer reviewed every legal detail. Meanwhile, I continued showing up at the office each morning as if nothing had changed. The strange part was how calm I felt. A few months earlier, the thought of selling would have filled me with anxiety. Now it felt like solving a problem that had been sitting in front of me the entire time. The more serious the discussions became, the more obvious the solution appeared. One Thursday afternoon, Rachel entered my office carrying a folder thicker than any I had seen before. She placed it on my desk and smiled. "You are going to want to read this." Inside was the strongest proposal we had received. The acquiring company was larger than the others and had an excellent reputation. They wanted the entire operation. They wanted the employees. They wanted the technology. Most importantly, they were willing to pay a price that exceeded even our most optimistic projections. I spent nearly an hour reviewing every page. When I finally looked up, Rachel was still sitting across from me. "What do you think?" she asked. I closed the folder slowly. "I think this changes everything." From that point forward, the process became intensely detailed. Accountants reviewed records. Attorneys examined contracts. Executives asked questions about operations and future planning. Weeks passed in a blur of conference calls and meetings. Yet despite all the activity, almost nobody outside a small circle knew what was happening. Brandon certainly did not. In fact, his confidence seemed to grow by the week. During one family dinner, he casually mentioned potential changes he would make once he had more influence over company decisions. I nearly laughed, not because the ideas were bad, because he spoke as though the future had already been guaranteed. My father nodded approvingly. My mother smiled. Neither of them noticed that I said very little that evening. By then, I had learned something important. People reveal far more when they believe you agree with them. A few days later, Daniel called with final updates. Most of the major concerns had been resolved. The acquiring company wanted to move forward quickly. If everything continued on schedule, signatures could happen within weeks. After hanging up, I walked through the office alone. Employees worked at their desks. Teams collaborated in conference rooms. Conversations echoed through hallways. Watching them, I felt proud. We had built something real, something that mattered. That realization made the next decision easier. Selling no longer felt like walking away. It felt like ensuring the company would continue growing under leadership that actually valued it. Late one evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone in the conference room overlooking the city. The final documents rested on the table in front of me. For several minutes, I simply stared at them. 8 years of work had led to this moment. Then I picked up the pen and signed. The transaction was not public yet. There were still announcements to prepare and details to finalize. But the outcome was now inevitable. The company Brandon expected to inherit no longer belonged to me. And the most surprising part was that he still had absolutely no idea. The public announcement was scheduled for a Thursday morning. By then, nearly every major detail had been finalized. Employees would be informed first. Clients would receive formal communication later that day. Industry publications would publish articles before the weekend. Everything had been carefully planned. The only people completely unaware of what was about to happen were the members of my family. That fact alone made the entire situation feel surreal. On Wednesday evening, my mother called and invited me to dinner the following night. Her tone suggested she had something important to discuss. I already knew what it was. Brandon had become increasingly impatient over the previous few weeks. He wanted certainty. He wanted timelines. He wanted assurances that his future was unfolding exactly as he imagined. I accepted the invitation without hesitation. By the time Thursday evening arrived, the announcement had already spread through the business community. Employees knew. Investors knew. Clients knew. The acquiring company had released its official statement. My phone had been ringing all day. Congratulations arrived from people across the country. Several competitors even reached out to express respect for what had been accomplished. Then I drove to my parents' house. The atmosphere felt strangely celebratory when I walked through the front door. My mother was smiling. My father seemed relaxed. Brandon looked more confident than ever. If anything, he appeared excited. During dinner, the conversation remained unusually light. Sports, weather, travel plans, small talk. It felt as though everyone was waiting for the right moment to discuss the real subject. Eventually, Brandon set down his fork and looked directly at me. "So," he said with a grin, "have you finally made any decisions?" I took a sip of water. "Actually, yes." My father leaned forward slightly. My mother smiled. Brandon looked almost relieved. "That is great," he said. "I knew you would come around eventually." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then I placed my glass on the table and looked around the room. The silence felt calm, controlled, almost peaceful. "The company is no longer mine," I said. At first, nobody reacted. The words seemed to hang in the air without fully registering. Brandon blinked. My mother frowned slightly. My father tilted his head. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means the transaction is complete." The room became completely silent. Brandon stared at me. "Transaction?" I nodded. The company was acquired. For several seconds, nobody moved. Brandon's confident expression vanished so quickly it almost looked unreal. My mother looked confused. My father looked stunned. I remained calm. There was no reason not to be. The decision had already been made. The documents had already been signed. The announcement had already happened. Nothing inside that dining room could change any of it. Brandon finally spoke. "You sold it?" "Yes." "Without discussing it with us?" The question almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it perfectly captured the assumptions that had created this situation in the first place. Us. As though ownership had always belonged to a group rather than the person who built it. As though approval had been required. I simply nodded. It was my decision to make. Nobody spoke after that. The silence stretched across the table while reality slowly settled into place. For months, they had been planning a future that no longer existed. And judging by the expressions around the room, they were only beginning to understand what had actually happened. The silence at the table did not last long. Brandon was the first to recover. He leaned back in his chair and stared at me as though I had just spoken a language he did not understand. "You cannot be serious," he said. His voice was controlled, but barely. "I am completely serious," I replied. My father set down his fork. "Why would you do something like that without talking to your family first?" There it was again. The assumption that my business decisions required family approval. Months earlier, that question might have frustrated me. Now it only confirmed everything I had already learned. I looked at him calmly. I spent 8 years building that company. Every major decision was mine. This one was no different. My mother shook her head slowly. "We were thinking about the future." "So was I said. Brandon laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "You knew what everyone expected." That was exactly the problem. The room became quiet again. This time the silence felt different. It no longer belonged to shock. It belonged to realization. For the first time, nobody at the table seemed certain of their position. Brandon crossed his arms. "You did this because of me." I considered the statement carefully. "No," I answered. "I did it because I realized something important." His eyes narrowed. "What?" I looked directly at him. "You were planning a future based on something that never belonged to you." Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. So I continued. "The company was not a family project. It was not an inheritance. It was not a shared asset. It was something I built." My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. My mother looked down at the table. Brandon remained silent. Years of memories began surfacing in my mind. The scholarships I earned alone. The weekends spent working while others relaxed. The tiny office with broken air conditioning. The sleepless nights before payroll deadlines. The risks nobody else shared. For so long I had accepted being overlooked because I believed effort would eventually speak for itself. Maybe it had. Maybe that was why everyone suddenly wanted ownership once the hard part was over. "Do you know what surprised me most?" I asked. Nobody answered. "Not that you wanted control. Not even that you expected it. What surprised me was how nobody ever asked what I wanted." The words hung in the air. My mother looked up. "That is not fair." I smiled gently. "Is it not?" She opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. Because deep down, she knew exactly what I meant. Every conversation had focused on Brandon's future, Brandon's opportunities, Brandon's expectations. Nobody had asked whether I wanted to spend the rest of my life running the company. Nobody had asked whether I wanted to sell. Nobody had asked whether I had different plans entirely. Brandon stared at the table for several seconds before speaking again. "So what happens now?" It was the first honest question he had asked all evening. I leaned back in my chair. "Now the company continues under new ownership. The employees keep their jobs. The clients keep receiving service. Business moves forward." "And you?" my father asked. For the first time that night, I felt a genuine sense of peace. The answer came easily. I finally get to decide what my future looks like. Nobody said another word after that. But as I looked around the table, I could see something changing. The illusion they had built over months was finally collapsing. And once illusions disappear, people are forced to confront reality whether they like it or not. The only question remaining was how each of them would respond when that reality fully settled in. 3 months later, I woke up to the sound of waves instead of alarms. That alone felt strange at first. For nearly a decade, every morning had started with schedules, meetings, emails, and deadlines. Now I lived in a small coastal town several hundred miles from the city. My apartment overlooked the ocean. There was a walking path along the shoreline. A local coffee shop sat 2 blocks away. Most days I spent my mornings reading on the balcony while fishing boats moved across the horizon. The adjustment took time. For the first few weeks, I kept reaching for my phone expecting urgent messages. They never came. The company was thriving under its new ownership. Former employees occasionally sent updates. Clients remained happy. Operations continued without interruption. Everything I had hoped would happen was happening. The difference was that none of it depended on me anymore. For the first time since my early 20s, my time belonged entirely to me. My relationship with my family changed as well. The weeks immediately following the announcement had been tense. There were difficult conversations, awkward silences, a great deal of disappointment. But reality has a way of settling in over time. Eventually, even people who dislike the truth must learn to live with it. My parents stopped asking questions about what might have been. Brandon stopped talking about leadership roles he never actually held. The fantasy had ended. What remained was reality. One afternoon, while walking along the beach, I received a call from my mother. We spoke for nearly an hour. For the first time in a long while, the conversation felt normal. She asked about my new home. She asked whether I was happy. There was no discussion about ownership, succession plans, or expectations. Just a mother talking to her son. When the call ended, I realized something important. The conflict had never really been about money. It had been about assumptions. Everyone had assumed my future belonged to them in some way. Once those assumptions disappeared, relationships became simpler. A few weeks later, another call arrived. This one came from Brandon. I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. His voice sounded different, quieter, less certain. We talked for a few minutes about ordinary things. Then he surprised me. I started a business, he said. I stopped walking. You did? Nothing huge, he replied. Just a small operation for now. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I smiled. That is great. And I meant it. For the first time in his life, Brandon was building something of his own. No shortcuts, no assumptions, no expectations, just effort. The same place everyone starts. After we hung up, I sat on a bench overlooking the water and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. I thought about everything that had happened over the previous year. The family dinners, the expectations, the negotiations, the decision that had changed everything. Looking back, I realized I did not feel anger anymore. I did not feel vindicated either. Mostly, I felt grateful. Grateful that I had trusted myself enough to make the decision others never would have understood. Grateful that I had chosen freedom instead of obligation. And most of all, grateful that I had finally learned a lesson that took 30 years to understand. People will always have opinions about what you should do with your life. But the person who bears the consequences of those decisions is you. In the end, I did not protect the company from my family. I simply protected my future. And standing there beside the ocean, watching the last light disappear beyond the horizon, I knew I would make the same choice again every single time.